Let me take you back in time. Back when the juggernaut of a company known as Square Enix was known as Squaresoft. Or, I guess, just Square, depending on who you ask. Before the merger with Enix, and right before the Final Fantasy movie nearly sank the entire company, forcing the creator of the series to exit the company out of shame. I'm sorry, what? Square was kinda riding high in the mid to late 90s. They were putting out hit after hit on the original PlayStation, most of which being Final Fantasy related, but a few original IPs too. Most of which I've never actually played. Yeah. Vagrant Story? Nope. Parasite Eve? Nuh-uh. Xenogears? Never touched it. Brave Fencer Musashi? I've only played a real little bit of it. Hell, I didn't even play FF7 for the first time until 2004. You can thank Kingdom Hearts for making me want to check that out, finally. It's a bit odd, isn't it? Some of my favorite games ever are JRPGs, and some of the most well-known of Square's PS1 output I've just never played. Or at least not until many years later. But there was one Squaresoft game on the PS1 that I did play when it was new, and that game was Threads of Fate. I won't lie, I actually wanted to do a video on this game years ago, but I appear to have lost my physical disc somehow. A real shame too, the disc was this really pretty shade of blue, it looked really nice. Well, I might as well go ahead and do one now since we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of the initial release. That, and because I want to give you guys something to tide you over while I'm still chipping away at the, as of now, still in production video on the PS2 game, Primal. Let me tell you, that video's turning out to be way more of a monster than I thought it'd be. Pun very much intended. So let me tell you all about Square's forgotten action RPG for the original PlayStation. So, what exactly is Threads of Fate all about? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Threads of Fate, or Do Prism if you want to call it by its Japanese name, is a game starring two characters with two separate storylines. One story follows Rue, a stoic boy with missing memories, yeah, that old JRPG chestnut, and Mint, the bratty banished princess keen on world domination. I'll get more into their individual stories a little bit later. No matter which character you choose, the goal is ultimately the same. Both characters hear of an ancient relic that is rumored to have the power to grant any wish, and it's a race to find it before anybody else can. Now let's get into the individual stories of each character. Let's start with Rue first. His story begins on a cold winter's night. He and his guardian, a woman named Claire, who took him in a few years prior when he lost his memories, live together in a remote cabin in the middle of the woods. One night, Rue hears an awful noise coming from his barn and decides to go check it out. That's when he... that's not supposed to be happening. Yeah, so I emulated my playthrough for this video, but the emulator I've been using is an old one that I've been using for years and years that I've just never updated. Oh, apparently the one I've been using hasn't been updated since 2007, which is years after I got a hold of it. Oh, good lord, maybe that's why it's still so buggy. And maybe that's why Legend of Legaia crashes in that one section in the last quarter of the game. If you know, you know. Anyway, Rue goes out and finds this freaky-looking dude with a giant hand. I'm sure there's a masturbation joke in there somewhere. Okay. So, this freaky dude is who the manual refers to as Arm of Death. We don't know why he's here, except to pick a fight with Rue, apparently, when Claire walks out and tries to intervene. This, sadly, gets her killed, and we then fast forward to the present day, 3 years later. With Rue learning of a legendary relic with the power to grant any wish, his mission is to find it and wish Claire back to life. Yeah, so his story is pretty heavy and remorseful, but on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we have our other playable character, Mint, the next in line for the throne of the East Heaven Kingdom. In her flashback 2 years before the beginning of the game, we're shown what a day in the life of the young spellcaster is like. Starting to eat dinner before the rest of her family arrives, and generally being a nuisance. In the midst of her mayhem, we're introduced to her little sister Maya, and it's here she delivers Mint some terrible news. That she's being stripped of her position as next in line for the throne. Mint, understandably, doesn't take the news well, and decides the best course of action is to attack Maya. This doesn't go well, as Maya is in possession of her own relic, the Book of Cosmos. Using the nigh-infinite power of this relic, Maya conjures up the one thing that can defeat Mint. A pumpkin, as Mint has a deep fear of them.
Bring out the
pumpkin.
Now hell-bent on taking back her place in the East Heaven Kingdom, Mint sets out on her own journey to find her own relic and become unstoppable. No matter who you play as, your story begins in the port town of... oh no... where both characters learn that there may be a relic hidden away somewhere in the nearby area. The way the two stories are told is pretty interesting. Both characters follow most of the same story beats once reaching the town. As a result of this, while they do have a couple of areas unique to their own respective stories, for the most part, you, the player, will be running through nearly all of the same areas and dungeons, and meeting all of the same primary characters. Though, for example, the scene that plays when meeting the archaeologist Dr. Klaus and his family is slightly different when you play as Rue than it is when you play as Mint, as is rescuing Elena from the bandits Smokey and Blood, who are also here to find the relic. So some story elements are different, at least. It's not 100% the same, especially once you start reaching the halfway point of the game. More on that later. So what's the actual gameplay in this video game like anyway? Threads of Fate is an action RPG with occasional platforming elements. Corona is your hub, with an inn to recover your health and save your game, and a shop to purchase attack and defense upgrades, and the front gate, which is how you access the levels, for lack of a better word. The game's story will send you across 7 levels, and like I mentioned earlier, 6 of them are in both characters' campaigns, and they each get their own exclusive level. It might be a bit disappointing that they don't have more than that, but I can imagine that this game was made with a bit of a smaller budget than some of Square's other titles, or it was made out of a desire to just make a smaller scale game. Either one of these could be true for all I know. And while the actual levels you go through between both characters is exactly the same, for at least the first half of their stories anyway, the game tries to make up for it by having the story scenes be different. And I think with that, I should start talking about the individual characters' playstyles. Rue carries with him an axe-like weapon called the Arc Edge, which kinda looks like someone glued a pizza slicer onto a guitar. He can do a basic 3-hit combo by pressing the X button, and a spinning slash by pressing triangle. He can also hit enemies in the air by pressing X while jumping, which is done with the circle button. I kinda low-key have a theory that Kingdom Hearts got the idea to map jumping to the circle button from this game. Mint fights with 2 oversized hoop earrings, I don't know, and has a similar melee combat style with the same controls, but it's with the special abilities that these characters have where things start to get a little bit more varied. Rue has the ability to transform into any of the monsters he defeats, and this opens up new ability sets for each monster he has in his quote-unquote roster. You can carry up to 4 monsters in your roster. Collecting a 5th will replace the first one you collected. And depending on the monster's moveset, this is how Rue uses MP. For example, this big lizard man uses fire techniques, so any elemental attack a monster uses consumes MP. Mint, on the other hand, is a spellcaster, so her magic attacks, which she performs by pressing triangle, are what uses her MP meter. She starts out with a fairly light list of magic that she can use, but you'll gain more as the story progresses, and some spells can be found hidden away in levels. With Mint, holding down the square button pulls up her list of magics, and pressing left and right on the D-pad allows you to scroll through your list. Pressing up and down will change what kind of effect that magic has. For example, the default water magic spell you start the game with looks like this. But pressing up on the D-pad while it's highlighted unlocks the three-way shot that looks like this. Now, I must have forgotten all about that since my last playthrough like a decade ago, or I'm only now finding out that you can change the effects of Mint's magic. Read the instruction manuals on these old games, kids. Having access to a variety of different spells is certainly interesting, but it's a bit undercut by the fact that Mint has to come to a complete stop while using them. She cannot move while using her magic, and it takes about half a second or so to actually launch the attack, so this can turn you into a sitting duck at times. Each level in the game is made up of several small, interconnected chunks that you traverse through. It's here that you'll be fighting enemies, solving puzzles, and seeing the story advance through these dialogue scenes. There's no voice acting in this game. This was a time before video game voice acting really became commonplace, but you can take as long as you want reading through these dialogue boxes. And there's a lot of reading you're going to be doing. It wouldn't be a Square game on PS1 if there wasn't. Now keep in mind, Threads of Fate isn't as long as some of those other titles, but there's still a lot of story crammed into this tinier package. Not just the main plot, but also the smaller moments with the supporting cast. And this game has a particularly endearing supporting cast, which I think is a good segue to go a little more in-depth with the story. No matter who you play as, the story hits a lot of the same beats. Both characters will run into the archaeologist Dr. Klaus and his wife Mira, but not before rescuing their daughter Elena from a couple of bandits. He'll tell the player character that at the end of the path is an atelier, or a magician's workshop, that may hold clues about the magical wish-granting relic. It's here you'll meet Rue if you're playing as Mint. Once you get there, no matter who you play as, you fight a boss, this freaky-looking demon horse thing. Defeating it and making it inside the atelier is where you meet Mint if you're playing as Rue. Upon returning to town and having Klaus go over the notes found in the atelier, we find that the relic has been sealed, and that to break it, we need to gather items from yet another atelier in an underground maze. This is another level that both characters will progress through in exactly the same way. Just dialogue scenes are different depending on who you're playing as. This level in particular is a little bit annoying because some sections loop in on each other, or at least it looks that way. So you'll find yourself running around in circles at a certain point. When you do finally manage to find the correct path, you gotta grab these 6 talismans that are then used as a stepping stone puzzle in another room. But not before running away from a boulder in a manner very similar to Crash Bandicoot. This jumping puzzle highlights one of the unfortunate shortcomings of the gameplay. Depending on where the camera is located, your depth perception might get thrown off and you'll miss whatever platform you're shooting for. This is sadly an issue that comes up quite a few times in the game. I've also had moments when I would go to make a running jump, even pressing the circle button, and the character just wouldn't jump. So yeah, the game has a bit of an issue with dropping inputs too. Yeah, the platforming in this game is a bit rough around the edges. It's not a static fixed camera, it moves along with you, but depending on the angle it's at, it can make trickier jumps like this one a real headache. You thankfully respawn if you land in a pit or a water hazard, provided you still have some HP left, so it's not the end of the world if you miss a jump, but I can see this annoying some players. There are a handful of rooms in the game where the camera actually is rotatable, but this isn't very often in dungeons, mostly just buildings in town. But wait, I hear you say, didn't you say that this was an action RPG? Where are the RPG elements? Well, in regards to such elements such as stat building and leveling up, Threads of Fate does things a bit differently. Though there's no traditional weapon and armor system, like buying and equipping new weapons and armor that you buy in shops or find in chests, you can increase your attack and defense stats by purchasing the appropriate items in Tanio's shop in town. There's also no inventory system like in other RPGs, so you don't actually have potions or other recovery items. Any health and magic restoring items are dropped by fallen enemies, and this is how you recover those when in a level. Though you will occasionally run into a fountain to recover HP. You can also recover your MP by simply attacking enemies with your standard melee attacks, oddly enough. So, if the game has no traditional experience and leveling system, how do you increase the maximum HP and MP? Well, the game takes a page from Final Fantasy II in that regard. To increase your MP, you just use your magic, whether it be Mint's magic or a special ability from one of Rue's transformations. And to increase your HP, you have to actually take damage from enemies. Now, this isn't really something you'll have to be all that mindful of, as the maximum HP level will rise no matter how much HP you actually have. You can comfortably try to keep your HP high and still get incremental bonuses as you go. But not having easier access to healing items can make certain areas a bit worrisome, especially boss fights. However, if you do run out of HP, you can revive yourself with coins of life, which essentially act as your continues. No matter which color you choose, you'll always restart at a checkpoint, usually at the start of the last screen you entered, at full health. The color of the coin just decides how much MP you respawn with. Coins of life are fairly abundant. At no point did I ever find myself running low on them, and they're given to you fairly frequently. If you do decide you want more, though, you can go to the church in town and make a donation to get more. Speaking of money, enemies don't drop that either, so how do you get it? Well, there's a couple of ways. You can find treasures inside of dungeons that you can sell, and strangely enough, the monsters and bosses you defeat can be sold as well. I like to imagine every monster you kill, you just lug back into town. Yeah, where do they keep all those dead animals? Then there's this guy. Holy crap, this guy. This is Rod. He's the wandering weapon craftsman. You can challenge him to a duel, but he requires an upfront charge of 100 gold. But if you beat him, he'll pay you 1,000. What's really interesting is at certain points in the story, he'll have a new weapon he'll fight you with, and his fighting style changes along with it. It's honestly worth it just to see all the crazy weapons he comes up with. On the topic of lovable characters, the second level is where we're introduced to Belle and Duke, the lovable pair of idiot mage treasure hunters. Belle is a femme fatale with a mean left hook, and Duke is her bodyguard and tier 3 sub. You can tell Duke is a simp, he even calls Belle Milady. Fun fact, this game is actually where I first heard the word Milady, and I thought all these years he was saying Milady. I thought he was calling her Milady. Anyway, in this level you fight Duke when you're playing as Rue, and you fight Belle when you're playing as Mint. You know, Belle likes to go on and on about being broke and not having enough money, but she could make a killing if she just sold her own bathwater. Don't let their appearances fool you, these two are quite capable. There's a few other characters here too, but I think I won't go too into detail on those. I'll let you discover them for yourself. Despite repeating the same levels and in largely the same order, Rue and Mint do get one exclusive level each. One of my favorite levels in the game is Rue's exclusive level, the Ghost Temple. At this point in the story, Rue and Mint split up to find magical items in order to awaken the Prima Doll, an automaton that was created to break the seal at the lake ruins where the relic is said to be sealed away. Rue heads to the Ghost Temple, while Mint heads to Gamel Forest, but not before facing off against Belle again and her flying machine, the Hexagon. We'll start with the Ghost Temple. It's the former residence of a powerful sorcerer who became possessed by evil spirits, and is now long abandoned, crawling with living skeletons and creepy dolls. As someone who always loved horror-themed levels in non-horror video games, this one was hitting all the right notes with me. You know, horror-themed levels in non-horror video games... Maybe this is why I ended up loving Castlevania so much. Rue is tasked with finding 2 gauntlets and 2... Solarets? Solarets. Yeah, these things. And to get a hold of them, he has to fight this freaking thing. Yeah, I have no idea how the hell they got away with a design like this in an E-rated game. Oh, actually, you know what? That's a whole other side tangent right there. This game is rated E for everyone. The strategy guide for this game has a T for teen rating on it, but the game itself is rated E. I have a feeling that changing this game's rating from T to E was a last-minute decision by somebody at the ESRB. And for an E-rated game, there's quite a bit of swearing in it, too. The back of the box says that the game contains mild language, so the swearing is never anything stronger than a hell or a damn. One character gets called a bastard at one point, but what's really funny is that in Mint's playthrough, the game will actually censor itself. I think the localizers were having a little too much fun here. This was one of the first E-rated games I ever played that had swearing in it, let alone this much. And oddly enough, this game is also where I learned the term expletive. Anyway, back on topic, Rue is searching for the gauntlets and the solarets, and it's here that we run into Elena, the daughter of the archaeologists we met earlier. There's a very short segment where we need to guide her around, but this is no escort mission. Nothing can happen to Elena that isn't scripted. She can't take damage, and if she does fall down a pit, she'll immediately respawn in a safe area before the jump. Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, Mint heads to the Gamel Forest to find a pair of magical earrings for the Prima doll. This level reminded me a lot of that one Forest Village level in Klonoa. Anybody ever play that? Her level is based around the wind magic that she gains at the beginning of the level, right after her fight with Belle. The Gamels are a peaceful clan, but since there's no other way to regain your MP other than melee attacking enemies, you're left with only the choice of attacking the Gamels, who will then return fire on you. At this point in Mint's story, her attacking these little guys out of random is pretty on brand for her character and is darkly hilarious. And of course, when you get back into town, you can sell them for cash. Wow, Mint just committed Gamel genocide for profit. She's a goddamn war profiteer. Both of these levels will involve puzzles of some kind. Rue will focus mainly on flipping switches, while Mint will use her wind magic to get these little windmills spinning. As I alluded to a little bit earlier, the game will occasionally break up the action gameplay with either some kind of platforming challenge or a puzzle. As I've stated earlier, the platforming's a bit rough around the edges, possibly from inexperience from the developers. Not to mention those dropped inputs when trying to make jumps that I complained about earlier. It's a small issue, but one that crops up just enough to be annoying. The characters, especially Rue and his transformations, have weight to them, so they feel a bit stiff to control in midair. It doesn't help when the camera is fixed and makes depth perception much trickier than it ought to be. The game's combat, as I'm sure you can probably see by the footage, all happens in real time, and it too can sadly be a bit jank at times. The game uses an auto-aim system for both melee attacks and spells. It'll auto-target the enemy closest to you, which can be useful when fighting more than one enemy, but if another enemy, or God forbid, an inanimate object that can be interacted with, is the closest thing to you, you'll end up attacking that instead of the enemy that's getting in free shots on you now. I will admit I'm not too familiar with Square's output from around this time, so I can't say if it's from inexperience or technical limitations of the original PlayStation. Both characters come to a complete stop when initiating a melee attack. Some of Rue's transformations can make combat a bit easier, but if the auto-aim isn't in your favor, it can lead to you attacking an entirely different enemy than the one you're focusing on. Mint has the misfortune of needing to be at a complete standstill when using magic, and with the funky auto-aim I mentioned earlier, you may end up abandoning this strategy entirely. Something that would have come in handy would have been the ability to either block enemy attacks or dodge out of the way of them. Rue gets the ability to do so very late in his story, but he literally only ever uses it in 2 boss fights, and only those 2 boss fights. This would have been very handy to have for the entire game, and I would have used it far more than his spin. Yeah, again, he comes to a complete stop when using it, and he'd only be able to face 1 enemy at a time, but I can think of scenarios where it would have been useful. It's kind of hard to critique visuals on PS1 games, but I gotta say, for the most part, I find this game to be a real treat to look at. This came out in Japan the same year as Final Fantasy VIII, about 8 months afterward. And while the character and enemy designs may not be as detailed as the ones in FF8, they still have a very strong art direction. I don't quite know how to describe it. It's like the characters all have this regalness to them. They're still very detailed, and considering that this game doesn't have a single pre-rendered element to it, it makes it all the more impressive. Really, the only major downside to the presentation is that the characters have the infamous 5th generation game brick hands, you know the ones. The hands and fingers are rendered as a single entity instead of each finger being individually rendered. Honestly, it was kinda standard at the time, so it's not really something I can critique too hard. The character faces don't emote very much, but the game does make up for it by using body language and in-game dialogue to make up the difference. There's also a few moments in-game where it uses anime-style expressions and freeze frames and the like to express extreme emotion for comedic effect. So it's not like the game is completely devoid of emotion. The game also doesn't have voice acting, so a majority of your playtime is going to be reading text boxes with just musical accompaniment. And speaking of music, oh my god, this is one of my favorite PS1 soundtracks ever. It is an extremely underrated soundtrack, and it has some excellent tracks on it. Although I will say, after hearing it about 1 billion times, you're probably gonna get sick of hearing the theme of Corona. The game's composer, Junya Nakano, would go on to be one of the composers for Final Fantasy X and the Nintendo DS remake of Final Fantasy IV. And if you go on to compose music for that series, I'd say you've proven yourself. If there were any other nitpicks I would have with Threads of Fate, one of them would be just how chatty this game can get. Yes, it's a story-driven game from 90s era Square, just not quite on the same scale of other games that came before or since, but they still pack a lot of story in this littler package. Each of the storylines can take you anywhere between 7 to 8 hours to finish, and in that time, you'll be seeing a lot of the story unfold through text boxes and cutscenes. Cutscenes, by the way, which cannot be skipped. You can mash the X button as fast as you can, but that's about all you'll be able to do to get through them on repeat playthroughs. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up with this game, I had a problem with keeping my PS1, and my PS2 for that matter, in proper working order, and as a result, whatever memory card I was using, primarily this mega memory card, yeah, remember these freaking things, would always get completely white, making me lose all of my save files. I'm convinced that losing all of your save files is one of the worst things that can happen to you as a gamer. Way worse than losing a close game of Fortnite or Madden will ever be, if you ask me. Hell, my blood still runs cold when my PS4 has to do that hard drive repair thing when my power goes out with it in sleep mode. So, whenever my data would inevitably get erased, I would have to sit through the same cutscenes and play through all of the same levels all over again. It's one of the reasons why I never finished this game as a kid. And speaking of playing through the same levels, I mentioned before that Rue and Mint have 6 of the same levels, but Mint has to do the Underground Ruins, the second level of the game, twice. That includes going through the maze in the beginning of the level, and finding all 6 of the platform stone things again. This time, though, with tougher enemies. I didn't have a problem with the game reusing levels between both stories, but this part right here was the only time I ever felt like the game was actively padding out the runtime. Hell, the repeat visits through Corona Forest aren't even this bad, at least the endgame is different. There are side quests in the game, but they are so tucked away out of sight that it's easy to miss them completely. For example, finding the legendary weapons and armor, which are very obviously cooking tools, can be used in the tavern in the back lot. The only other time you're likely to visit this tavern besides for story purposes is to buy drinks to recover your MP. These cooking tools are used in conjunction with a certain number of specific enemies. Bring them back to the tavern and the bartender will cook you things that will increase certain parameters. There's also the rare wine item that you can find. Giving it to Hobbs in his backlot shop instead of selling it at Tonio's will drastically drop the prices of the stat increasing items on sale here from 30,000 gold each to a far more reasonable 5,000. In all the years that I've had this game, I'm only now finding out that these side quests are here. They're that optional and that out of the way. Alright, so I think it's time we start bringing this video to a close. Threads of Fate was released at a very interesting point in Square's life. It came out the same year as the Japanese release of Final Fantasy VIII, and just less than half a year before the Japanese release of the PlayStation 2. Final Fantasy IX was still in production when Threads of Fate shipped, and we were still a bit of a ways off from the Final Fantasy movie, which very nearly bankrupted Squaresoft. Or at least I think it almost bankrupted Squaresoft. It definitely delayed that merger with Enix until 2003. But what might be more fascinating about Threads of Fate would be the people involved in its creation. This was one of the very first games, if not the first game, to be written by Daisuke Watanabe, who would then go on to be one of the writers for Final Fantasy X, and be a long-running writer for the Kingdom Hearts series. The story of the game was written by Makoto Shimamoto, who was one of the battle planners for the Super NES classic Chrono Trigger. He now currently works at the Nintendo-owned studio Monolith Soft, where he's had a hand in working on the battle system for the Xenoblade series. Producer Hiromichi Tanaka also produced Chrono Cross, released that same year, and would go on to produce and direct across various Final Fantasy releases in the years following. And last, but far from least, would be the director of the game, Koji Sugimoto. He had previously worked as a programmer on the Super Nintendo classic Chrono Trigger and the PS1 classic Xenogears. Threads of Fate was his first time heading his own team to put his own story and characters together. To this day, he still works at Square Enix as a programmer, having taken a swing at creating his own original story. He still looks back fondly on his work on Threads of Fate, even mentioning that he would like to return to this universe someday if given the opportunity. According to a 2015 interview with GatherYourParty.com, Sugimoto did pitch an idea for a sequel to the heads of Square Enix in 2004, but it was shot down. The only real continuation we did get for this game isn't even an officially licensed one. In 2003, a fan-made game called Duo Princess was released onto the internet. It's a sprite-based, top-down action-adventure where players control Mint and her sister Maya. I haven't played this myself, and for all I know, this could be an asset flip with Threads of Fate elements included, like characters and enemy designs, but seeing someone try to continue the legacy of this series is a-okay with me. Overall, Threads of Fate is very much a product of its time. It may be a bit rough around the edges in terms of its gameplay, and it can get a bit chatty and long-winded at points, but its story is engaging, the presentation is remarkably solid for the time frame in which the game came out, and I don't think there's a single unlikable character in the whole cast. It's not a game that I think you should drop everything you're doing to sit down and play, but I can at least recommend checking out what the game does offer, whether you're playing it or just watching the story segments on YouTube. The game's story is engaging enough that it can make up for whatever minor shortcomings the gameplay has. You will have to do a little bit of digging to find it, but if Square Enix ever decides to toss it up on the PS5 store for like, say, $10, then yeah, I can recommend checking it out. Though, if you are gonna play it, start with one character and play their story all the way through, and then save after you beat it. And then after that, then start the second character's playthrough. Don't do what I did and play both characters on separate save files, or else you won't get the special epilogue ending unless you go back and play through the game with the other character again. It may not be perfect, but I do think it'd be cool if more people remembered Threads of Fate, Square's forgotten action RPG.